Right there, in the middle of the police station lobby, under the cold fluorescent lights, an unbelievable action happened. A punch. The uniformed policeman's fist hit the woman's face. A dry sound rang out. A brutal scene, a blatant abuse of power taking place right where justice should be done. But the policeman, in his anger and prejudice, made a fatal mistake. A mistake that would completely ruin his career and his life. Because the woman he had just assaulted, the woman who was clutching her face in pain with blood dripping from the corner of her mouth, was not a weak person. She was someone who was sent specifically to investigate such acts, and she was in disguise. He had just attacked the man who was investigating him. The whole thing was recorded. The curtain had fallen, and hell was about to open for the police officer. His dark past was about to be exposed. What happens next? What will the investigation reveal? And what sentence awaits this brutal abuser? Follow this shocking story. You won't want to miss what happens next. Cold white light from rows of fluorescent tubes high up in the ceiling illuminated the vast, lifeless lobby of the Metropolitan Police Department. The light highlighted the bland beige walls, some of which had peeled paint, and the dull gray tile floors that had been worn by countless people who had come here with all sorts of emotions: anxiety, fear, anger, and sometimes faint hope. The air was thick with the smell of cheap disinfectant, mixed with the smell of stale coffee wafting from a corner of the room, and an indescribable smell of tension, power, and indifference. Right in the middle of the lobby was a tall, wide reception desk made of dark plywood with a scratched surface, creating a physical and psychological barrier between the uniformed people and the civilians. A few stiff blue plastic chairs lined the wall, almost empty on this gloomy afternoon. On the wall hung a few posters, yellowed by time, about crime prevention or missing persons, which no one seemed to care about anymore. This place, although it was the headquarters of those whose mission was to serve and protect, exuded a bureaucratic, cold air that made people feel small and powerless. Through the heavy glass doors, a black woman in her 40s quietly entered. She wore a worn canvas jacket, faded jeans, and simple sneakers. Her thick curly hair was pulled back into a bun. Her face was tired, her eyes flickering with worry as she looked around the unfamiliar lobby. She carried a cheap, wrinkled canvas tote bag. She was Sarah Jenkins, a carefully prepared role for Internal Affairs Division 1AD Agent Evelyn Reed. Beneath the guise of a vulnerable, everyday citizen anxious to report a crime was a veteran agent with a keen eye for observation and a relentlessly analytical mind. Evelyn was taking in every detail: the indifference in the air, the distant decor, the attitudes of the few office workers who passed by. She wasn't here for a serious case. Her cover as Sarah Jenkins was to report that her wallet had gone missing somewhere nearby a few hours earlier. An incident disturbing enough to warrant a visit to the police station, but not major enough to warrant special attention, at least not at first. Evelyn's real target was Officer Frank Miller, who was sitting behind the counter. Internal Affairs had received numerous anonymous complaints over the past few months about Miller's bossy attitude, racist rhetoric, and rudeness toward people, especially those who were minorities or appeared poor. The undercover operation was intended to verify those allegations firsthand. A tiny microphone discreetly hidden on Evelyn was recording every sound, and a teammate was likely monitoring the situation from an unmarked car parked nearby. Officer Frank Miller, a stocky white man in his 50s, in a rumpled uniform, hunched behind the high counter. The badge pinned to his chest looked worn, as if he had seen too much and no longer held any pride. He had a bored expression on his face, his eyes fixed on the screen of his cell phone, completely ignoring the woman who had just entered. A stack of papers lay askew beside him, and a half-empty paper coffee cup stood alone. Miller's demeanor exuded exhaustion from his job, a quiet dissatisfaction, and a barely concealed contempt for the people he dealt with every day. Evelyn, as Sarah took a small breath, trying to appear timid, and approached the counter. She waited for a few seconds, but Miller still did not look up. "Sorry," Evelyn spoke softly, somewhat hesitantly. Miller raised his head slowly, his eyes glinting with annoyance at being disturbed. He looked Evelyn up and down with an unfriendly appraisal. "What is it?" His voice was curt and impatient. The play had begun, and Evelyn had a feeling that the heavy atmosphere in the room was about to become much more stifling. I want to report something," Evelyn said, her voice a little shaky, her eyes looking down at the counter as if she couldn't bear to look the officer in the eye. "I think I lost my wallet." Miller let out a loud sigh, looking utterly frustrated. He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest. "Lost wallet? Where? When?" The question was thrown without a trace of concern or sympathy. Evelyn repeated her prepared story. She had gone shopping in a nearby area, and when she got home, she discovered that her wallet, which contained some cash and some identification, was missing. She spoke slowly, sometimes hesitantly, like someone who was confused and worried. Miller listened with half an ear, his eyes occasionally glancing down at the phone. "That's it?" he interrupted Evelyn as she finished. "Is there much money in the wallet? It must have fallen somewhere. Did you check it thoroughly?" "I checked, officer. I'm pretty sure it's lost or stolen," Evelyn replied softly, still maintaining the tone of someone who needed help. "I just wanted to make a report in case someone picked up or used my papers." "Report, report," Miller muttered, rolling his eyes in disdain. "Are you sure it really happened, or are you imagining it? Some people like to exaggerate," he said. Grab A form from a nearby stack of papers was tossed rudely at Evelyn. "Fill this out. Write clearly." Evelyn took the form, mentally registering every gesture, every disrespectful word. This was exactly what the complaints had described. She began to pretend to read through the form, then looked up and asked, "Officer, after I'm done, can I have a copy of this report? So I can redo the paperwork." That logical and procedural question seemed to make Miller even more frustrated. "What's the point of a copy? Just fill it out first and then figure it out. Trouble." "And may I have your name and badge number? I'll write it down for the receptionist information," Evelyn continued, her voice still soft, but this was an important part of the internal affairs test. That seemed to be the last straw. Miller slammed his hand on the table, gritting his teeth. "What are you asking for? It's none of your business. Just fill out the form." The hostility in his voice grew noticeably. Miller's eyes were now fixed on Evelyn, a cold stare filled with prejudice. "Why do people like you always have to cause trouble?" he blurted, his voice dripping with undisguised racial slur. "What are you trying to gain by coming here? Or to get attention?" Evelyn felt a cold shiver of anger run down her spine, but she forced herself to keep her shoulders back. "Officer," she said, trying to keep her voice calm but with a hint of firmness, "I'm not causing trouble. I'm a citizen reporting a legitimate incident, and I'm just asking to be treated with respect." The remark, though politely delivered, was a direct challenge to Frank Miller. It struck at his ego and his deep-seated prejudices. How could a shabbily dressed black woman dare lecture him, a police officer, right in the command post? Miller's face turned red with rage. His usual boredom was gone, replaced by an uncontrollable rage. "Respect?" Miller roared, his voice echoing through the deserted lobby. He slammed his fist down on the counter again, rattling the stacks of papers. "You want respect? Who do you think you are?" And then, in a moment of madness, one no one could have foreseen, the unthinkable happened. Officer Frank Miller, blinded by rage and prejudice, suddenly leaned over the high wooden counter. Pop! A punch from the heavens. Miller's fist, flesh and blood and fueled by rage, slammed into Evelyn's left cheek. The dry, sickening sound of impact echoed in the silence. Evelyn felt a sharp pain, an electric current running from her jaw to her temple. The world seemed to spin before her eyes. She staggered back a few steps, one hand clutching her burning, aching cheek. The tote bag fell from her hand, clattering to the cold floor. Warm blood began to seep from the corner of her mouth. Stunned, everyone in the lobby, a few office workers who had just passed by, maybe one or two other citizens waiting in the far corner, froze, eyes wide with disbelief at the sight. A police officer had just punched a woman right at the reception desk. After a moment of shock at his own violence, Miller seemed to regain his composure. Instead of repentance, his warped, self-protective instincts kicked in. He began to yell, his voice filled with false indignation, trying to regain the upper hand and blame his victim. "See? See?" Miller pointed at the stunned Evelyn. "She tried to attack me. She resisted an officer. You saw it all." Chaos ensued, but Miller did not know that the blow had not only drawn blood from a disguised woman. It had also ended his career and his freedom. The curtain had come down. Officer Miller's shout and the sound of a fist breaking the oppressive silence of the lobby. Immediately, two other police officers working nearby and a lieutenant, who seemed to be the shift supervisor, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, rushed to the reception area. The scene before them was chaotic and confusing. A black woman was staggering against the wall, clutching her face, blood dripping from the corner of her mouth. Her handbag was sprawled on the floor. Officer Miller, their colleague, was standing behind the counter, red-faced and panting, pointing and yelling at the woman for assault and resistance. "What's going on here?" the lieutenant asked, his voice trying to sound calm, but his eyes showing the seriousness when he saw the injury on the woman's face and Miller's agitated demeanor. "Lieutenant, she attacked me!" Miller hastily defended himself, trying to spin the story in his favor. "I just asked her to fill out a lost wallet report, and she got mad and tried to climb over the counter and hit me. I was defending myself." He tried to spin a completely fabricated scenario, hoping the chaos and his police status would fool his superiors. The other officers looked at each other, confused, not knowing what to believe. They looked from the silent, pained woman to Miller, who was furiously telling her story. But the woman's silence did not last long. Evelyn Reed, though her left cheek was throbbing and her head was still a little dizzy from the unexpected punch, quickly regained control. The physical pain was real, but her will and training as an internal affairs agent were even stronger. She was trained to deal with dangerous and unexpected situations, but no one could have prepared her for such a brutal assault, right in a place considered a bastion of the law. She slowly lowered her hands from her face. The red swelling and the small trickle of blood around her mouth added to her Sarah Jenkins look, but her eyes did not. When she looked up at the supervising lieutenant, then slowly turned to Officer Miller, who was stunned by the victim's strange composure, the gaze was cold, sharp, and powerful. The nervousness and timidity were gone. Her voice rang out, no longer soft or trembling, but clear, sharp, and carrying an unmistakable authority, enough to drown out the noise in the hall. "Lieutenant Thompson," she called her supervisor, "I'm Agent Evelyn Reed, Internal Affairs, badge number 784. She reached into her old coat and pulled out a small wallet. Instead of her Sarah Jenkins identification, she flipped it open, revealing a distinctive yellow Internal Affairs ID card with her photo and name clearly visible under the clear plastic. "I'm on an undercover investigation mission at this facility." She turned her razor-sharp gaze to Officer Frank Miller, who stood frozen in place, his face beginning to contort in horror. "Officer Frank Miller," Evelyn continued, her voice as cold as ice, "you have just assaulted an Internal Affairs agent in the performance of his official duties. The entire incident, including your punch and your racist remarks, was recorded and may have been captured on video by this very police department security system." A deadly silence fell over the lobby. All eyes turned to Miller, who now looked as if he had been struck by lightning. His face, red with anger, quickly turned pale, then white as a sheet. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead, running down his temples in rivulets. His eyes widened, looking from Evelyn to the IA card, as if he couldn't believe the terrible truth that had just been revealed. Internal affairs. The sound escaped Miller's dry, lost throat. No, it can't be. He understood. He understood everything. The woman he had despised, insulted, and beaten mercilessly was the one sent to investigate him. He had fallen into the perfect trap by committing his worst act. All the lies, all the cover-ups were now meaningless. The evidence was undeniable. The collapse was swift and complete. Miller's legs shook, and he staggered, clutching the edge of the counter to keep from falling. "Oh God, I don't know. I really don't know." He began to stammer out a meaningless plea, his voice filled with panic and despair. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It was a mistake. I'm stressed. Work is too much. Please forgive me." His last despicable words, trying to cling to a fragile glimmer of hope in the nightmare he had created. Lieutenant Thompson, stunned for a moment, quickly regained his professional composure. He understood the gravity of the situation. Assaulting an IA agent in the command post was an unthinkable scandal. "Miller!" he ordered firmly. "Stand still! You!" He turned to the other two officers. "Take Officer Miller to the interrogation room immediately. Disarm him!" The two officers, still in shock, immediately obeyed. They moved to restrain Miller, who had no strength left to resist, and carried him away in heavy silence. Lieutenant Thompson turned back to Evelyn, his face filled with guilt and concern. "Agent Reed, are you okay? I'll call an ambulance right away. I'm sorry for this terrible incident." At that moment, several men in civilian clothes, looking quick and professional, walked quickly into the lobby. They were Evelyn's support team from Internal Affairs. They had received a signal or notification of the attack and were on the scene immediately. One of them went over to Evelyn, checked her injuries, and spoke briefly with Lieutenant Thompson. Internal Affairs officially took over the scene and the investigation. The curtain has fallen, but the real storm is just beginning to brew at this city's police department. The attack on Special Agent Evelyn Reed in the lobby of the police department sent shockwaves through Internal Affairs, IA, and the entire chain of command. It was not just an isolated act of violence, but also irrefutable evidence of the corruption and oversight failures that IA was trying to uncover. The investigation into Officer Frank Miller was immediately elevated to the highest priority with unprecedented scope. The reception area was cordoned off to collect evidence. Every physical trace, from Evelyn's blood on the floor to her fingerprints on the counter, was carefully recorded. Most importantly, the police department's security camera system, which was installed to monitor activities and ensure safety, now acted as a steely witness, recording the entire incident, from Miller's insulting words to the brutal punch and subsequent attempt to lie. The audio recording from Evelyn's hidden device further reinforced the evidence of Miller's racist motive and baseless provocation. Frank Miller was repeatedly interrogated by veteran IA investigators. Faced with overwhelming evidence, his initial resistance quickly collapsed. He was forced to admit to the assault, although he tried to blame it on stress and provocation. However, the IA was not done with the current incident. Their goal was to pull back the rug to see how much dirt had been hidden underneath all these years. They began digging into Miller's extensive police record, which spanned decades of service. Every performance review, every use of force report, every citizen complaint that had ever been attached to his file was re-examined with a new, more critical lens. And what they found was shocking, but not entirely surprising to those who had long suspected Miller. It was a clear picture of a long-standing, systematic pattern of misconduct. A series of previous complaints about Miller's bossy demeanor, racist language, and discrimination against women, immigrants, and other vulnerable people had been documented. Incidents ranged from threats and public humiliation to petty physical altercations and abuses of power to harassing people. More troubling is the way these complaints were handled. In many cases, former supervisors appear to have believed Miller's version of events, saying that people were overreacting or uncooperative. Some cases were ruled to be insufficient evidence or were dealt with only verbal reprimands and mild warnings. There are clear signs that the blue wall of silence, cover-ups, and internal deference allowed Miller to escape more serious consequences in the past, allowing him to become increasingly abusive and dismissive of discipline. IA decided not to let the old victims be forgotten. They proactively contacted those who had filed complaints against Miller. Initially, many were hesitant, fearing retaliation. But when they learned that Miller had been arrested and faced serious charges, along with assurances of safety from IA, many bravely stepped forward to provide more detailed testimony, even new evidence that they had previously dared not bring to light. Heartbreaking stories of humiliation, fear, and helplessness at the hands of a law enforcement officer gradually emerged, painting a dark and terrifying portrait of Frank Miller. While the internal investigation was in full swing, news of the incident leaked out and quickly became the focus of the media. The headlines were sensational. Internal Affairs Inspector assaulted by police at command post during undercover investigation. Racism and violence scandal rocks police department. Police officers' dark past exposed after attack on colleague. A wave of public outrage erupted. Citizens expressed disgust at Miller's behavior and raised serious questions about the culture, discipline, and oversight of the entire police force. Civil rights organizations and activists organized protests, demanding comprehensive reform, transparency, and severe punishment not only for Miller but also for those who showed signs of covering up for him in the past. Political pressure mounted on the mayor and police chief to make strong statements, pledging to clean up the department and regain the public's trust. The investigation into Frank Miller is now about more than just a punch. It has become a sweeping exposé of hidden corners, systemic failures, and the need for radical change in public service. Miller's criminal past is slowly being unearthed, and it portends an even darker future ahead. With the overwhelming evidence from the assault on Agent Evelyn Reed and a long history of past misconduct uncovered by Internal Affairs, Frank Miller's future was sealed early on. The decision to fire him from the police force was swift and decisive, ending his scandalous career once and for all. But the fallout didn't stop there. The district attorney's office, under pressure from the public and with the close cooperation of the Internal Affairs Division, formally charged Frank Miller with a series of serious criminal offenses. The charges included assault causing serious injury to a law enforcement officer. Since Evelyn Reed was an IA agent, this crime carries a more severe penalty than simple assault. Abuse of authority, false statements due to the initial attempt to blame the victim, and most importantly, hate crimes based on the explicit racial slurs that were recorded. Frank Miller's trial attracted intense media and public attention. The prosecution presented an incredibly strong case. They showed security camera footage that clearly captured Miller's brutal punch. They played audio from Evelyn's device, exposing his insults and his arrogant demeanor. Agent Evelyn Reed, despite the faint scar on her cheek, testified professionally and forcefully. The highlight of the trial was when the prosecution detailed the Internal Affairs Bureau's investigation into Miller's past. A series of witnesses, former victims of Miller's abuse and threats, bravely came forward to tell their stories in court. Records of ignored complaints and lenient cases were released, painting a terrifying picture of a systematic abuse of power that had been tolerated for far too long. Miller's defense team had little recourse. They could not deny the punch or the recorded words. Their only strategy was to try to minimize the charges, focusing on the court's leniency, citing work pressure, a moment of uncontrolled anger, and emphasizing Miller's belated repentance. Miller, in his orange prison jumpsuit, broke down, wept, and apologized, but it was too late. After deliberation, the jury quickly returned a verdict: Frank Miller was guilty on all counts charged. The day of the verdict was a day when long-awaited justice finally came. The judge who presided over the trial, before reading the verdict, had some very stern words. He spoke of the moral corruption of one entrusted with the duty of upholding justice, of the deadly dangers of racial prejudice when combined with state power, and of the failure of the system in allowing wrongdoing to continue unchecked. "This sentence," the judge announced, his voice echoing throughout the solemn courtroom, "is not just for the punch you threw at Agent Reed. It is for all the voices that have been silenced, the tears that have been shed in silence, the fear you have instilled in the citizens you were charged to serve over the years. The accumulation of these crimes demands a punishment that is both proportionate and deterrent." And then the verdict was announced. Frank Miller was sentenced to 13 years in prison, a lengthy sentence that reflected the seriousness of the attack on an internal affairs agent on duty, the violence in a public place, the hate crime element, and especially the long-standing pattern of misconduct that had come to light. The verdict was greeted with relief and a sense of justice in the community, especially among those who had been victims of Miller. It sent a strong message that abuse of power and racism would not be tolerated, no matter what uniform the offender wore. The city's police department, under intense pressure, was forced to make more substantial and far-reaching reforms in its hiring process, ethics training, internal oversight mechanisms, and handling of citizen complaints. For Special Agent Evelyn Reed, the conviction was the end of a dangerous and painful case. She had done her job well, exposing a dangerous abuser and serious flaws in the system. But the price was physical and emotional scars. The case once again underscored the importance and risk of internal affairs, the silent but necessary battle to keep law enforcement clean. The story ends as a bitter but necessary reminder that power can easily corrupt without checks and accountability. Racial prejudice is a cancer that can silently destroy the trust and integrity of our most important institutions. And sometimes, justice requires brave people who dare to disguise themselves and face danger to lift the veil that hides the dark truths hidden behind seemingly solid symbols of power. The fight for fairness and integrity continues, relentlessly. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you like this content, please click like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories, because tomorrow, we will have another meaningful story for you.